at first.
I suppose then that he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first, he'd see shadows most easily, then images and reflections of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Of these, he'd be able to study the things in the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun.
Of course.
Finally, I suppose, he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, in its own place, and be able to study it.
Necessarily so.
And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some ways the cause of all the things that he used to see.
It is clear that would be his next step.
What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others?
Certainly.
And if there had been any honors, places, or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which uses came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who could thus best provide the future, do you think that our men would desire these rewards, or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't we feel with Homer that he would much prefer to work the earth as a serf belonging to another, one without possessions, and go through any suffering, rather than share their opinions and live as they do?
I suppose he would rather suffer anything than live like that. Consider this too. If this man went down into the cave again and sat down in his same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness?
Certainly would. And before his eyes had recovered, and the adjustment would not be quick, while his vision was still dim, if he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? And as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him?
They certainly would.
This whole image, Wilson, must be fitted together with what we said before. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you grasp what I hope to convey, since that is what you wanted to hear about. Whether it's true or not, only the God knows. But this is how I see it. In the noble realm, the form of the good is the last thing to be seen, and is reached only with difficulty. Once one has seen it, however, one must conclude that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, and it produces both light and its source in the visible realm, and that in the intelligible realm it controls and provides truth and understanding, so that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it.
I have the same thought, at least as far as I make it.
Come then, share with me this one thought also. It isn't surprising that the ones who get to this point are unwilling to occupy themselves with human affairs, and that their souls are always pressing upwards, eager to spend their time above. For after all, this is surely what we'd expect, if indeed things fit the image I described before.
It is.
What about what happens when someone turns from divine study to the evils of human life? Do you think it's surprising, since his sight is still dim, that he hasn't yet become accustomed to the darkness around him, that he behaves awkwardly and appears completely ridiculous if he's compelled, either in the courts or elsewhere, to contend about the shadows of justice or the statues of which they are the shadows, and to dispute about the way these things are understood by people who have never seen justice itself?
That's not surprising at all.
No, it isn't. But anyone with any understanding would remember that the eyes would be confused in two ways from two causes. Namely, they come from light into darkness, when they come from darkness into the light. Realizing that the same applies to the soul, when someone sees a soul disturbed and unable to see something, won't laugh mindlessly. It will take take into consideration whether it has come from brighter light and is dim without having yet become accustomed to the dark, or whether it has come from greater ignorance and greater light and is dazzled by the increased brilliance. Then he'll declare the first soul happy in its experience in life, and he'll pity the latter. But even if he chose to make fun of it, at least he'd be less ridiculous than if he laughed at a soul that has come from the light above.
What you say is very reasonable.
If that's true, then here's what we must think about these matters. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely, putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes.
They do say that.
But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul, until it is able to study that which is and the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call the good. Isn't that right?
Yes. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and tries to redirect it appropriately.
So it seems.
Could you stop it?
Before we move into some of the questions we prepared, a couple of you indicated that this is unfamiliar subject matter to you. So do you have any questions about what's going on before we move forward? Questions are a good thing in Plato, so ask away.
What's the stage for this, basically?
What's the setting for it?
The stage upon which this is built.
It's part of a dialogue, so it was not meant to be performed as a play. It's something that you would read or perhaps read in someone's house, but not necessarily act out. Does that answer your question?
So it's basically a study of between you and this.
Between me and the text?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Is it typical in these dialogues that the student is so acquiescing?
Most of the time. In book 2, the discussion that sets this off is when Glaucon and Adeimantus step in and say, Plato, or Socrates, we're not convinced by your argument so far. And they give very good speeches that spur him on to this discussion. But you're right, so far in this part of the dialogue, they just say yes. Okay, wanted to start with how does Socrates' cave complement Christian ideas? And I'm going to let Lindsay start this off.
I have a lot that I wish I could say about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just choose one thing and then ask the same question back to Laura and maybe open up for the things that others have seen. But what I wanted to draw attention to is what I think is so profound here in Plato's depiction of the basic human condition. And the line that for me is haunting, every time I read it, it just gives me chills, is right at the beginning. Usually that's not where the haunting line is. But if you look down to Socrates' third saying, he just starts out by saying, they're like us. Right? So he's defining these prisoners as humans. And that's resonated with me every time I've read this to think about, oh, okay, he's actually describing the human condition. And when you think about it, his depiction is really quite an interesting one. He's talking about people who are chained up. They're prisoners. They are caught in a situation of which they are helpless to escape. Right? In fact, they can't even move. They're just fixed. And yet, in that situation, they have a somewhat, well, not somewhat, they lack an understanding of their prisoner-like condition. And to me, all of a sudden, this starts ringing bells for the way that Jesus describes the human condition. He basically says, you are a captive. What you need is liberation from your reality. And you know what? You don't even realize you're a captive. So your first item of business is to come to grips with the fact that your reality is a false reality. And there's a really real place out there that you must become aware of so that you recognize you are in a prison and need a liberator. What would you say in terms of what resonates?
Similarly, the idea that a spiritual reality can be just as real or more real than the visible reality that we touch and feel every day. And I came to this passage first through C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. How many of you have read The Last Battle? Okay, at the end, when the characters come out into real Narnia, after Narnia has passed away, they say, this looks like a more vivid version of the Narnia that we're familiar with. And Jules, the unicorn, says, this is my real country, I've come home. There's that sense of recognition of all the good things in this world, and yet a realization that those things were shadows of the really real world. And one of the characters, who's a professor, says, dear me, it's all in Plato. What do they teach them at these schools? So for me to understand that the things I love in this world can be warped and can be twisted, but the part of them that my soul is drawn to, those things exist in the spiritual world as well. We wanted to hear responses from you. Where do you see connections here between Plato and Christianity? We'll do a critique later. Yes?
Okay, so especially on the first